The stars had seen 1,000 civilizations rise and crawl their way into the void. Most arrived trembling, most arrived begging. The galactic conclave had catalogued 4,847 spacefaring species across 11 star clusters, and in all that time, not one had surprised them. Not really. So when the Kethari survey vessel Eternal Measure dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of humanity's solar system, senior xenobiologist Vailrun Those was already bored. He pulled up the preliminary file on his translucent data slate and skimmed it the way a man skims a menu at a restaurant he's visited 100 times. Oxygen breathers, carbon-based, fragile skeletal structure, liquid-dependent cellular biology, average lifespan short enough to be embarrassing. Gravity tolerance narrow, radiation resistance almost non-existent. He sighed and dictated his preliminary conclusion before he'd even reached the third planet. Species designation, human. Classification, grade 4 biological limitation. Recommended status, protected. Interstellar travel, contraindicated. The Eternal Measure entered orbit above Earth on a Tuesday morning. Below them, the planet glittered blue and white, achingly beautiful, almost heartbreakingly fragile-looking, like something that would shatter if you held it wrong. Vailrun watched it rotate slowly beneath the ship and felt, if he was honest, a little sad. They always looked so alive from up here. They always looked like they believed in themselves. The formal delegation arrived at the orbital platform 3 hours later. 7 humans. They wore pressed clothing, carried leather-bound folders, and smelled faintly of a stimulant beverage that Vailrun's translator flagged as calf-based neural accelerant, habitual consumption noted across species. Their lead delegate was a tall woman named Director Amara Osai, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word ended careers. Vailrun presented the biological limitation notice with practiced diplomacy. He explained gently that it was not a punishment, that the conclave truly admired humanity's spirit. That protected status was, in fact, an honor. It meant the conclave considered humanity worth preserving. Deep space, he explained, was simply beyond human biology. The radiation alone beyond the heliopause would be catastrophic. The gravitational variables near transit corridors would collapse human cardiovascular systems. The psychological toll of true deep space isolation had destroyed hardier species then. Director Osai raised one hand. Vailrun stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the notice sitting on the table between them. Then she looked back at him. "We'll take this under advisement," she said pleasantly. She folded the document, tucked it under her arm, and stood up. "Can I offer you coffee?" she added. "We brought a thermos." Vailrun filed his report that evening. It was thorough, professional, and completely correct by every measurable conclave scientific standard. He noted that the humans had been polite, had asked intelligent questions, and had not signed anything. He did not flag this last detail as significant. That was his first mistake. 18 months later, a Kethari scout vessel following a routine deep space survey route picked up a construction beacon broadcasting from coordinates that, by every astrophysical standard, no living creature should be anywhere near. The beacon was coming from inside the exclusion zone of Magnetar PSR J 1745290. The scout captain, a grizzled veteran named Herc, stared at his display for a full minute before he did anything. Then he turned to his co-pilot. "Get me a visual," he said quietly. The visual came up. It was a space station, a large one, half-constructed, struts and panels floating in neat organized clusters, robotic arms swinging in programmed arcs, and there, moving along the outer scaffold in pressurized suits, small figures. Dozens of them, moving with purpose, moving with ease. Herc leaned forward very slowly. One of the figures stopped, looked directly at the scout vessel's camera drone, and waved. Herc filed his report as a probable sensor malfunction. Because the alternative, that soft, radiation-fragile, Grade 4 biological limitation humans were building a space station next to a magnetar and waving at him, was simply not something his brain was prepared to process before breakfast. Back on Earth, in a cluttered office covered in blueprints and empty coffee cups, Chief Engineer Yolanda Ferris read the scout sensor ping alert on her tablet, snorted, and went back to her stress calculations. They had a third ring to design. The Conclave's mistake, the one that would later be studied in diplomatic academies across 6 star systems, was assuming that humanity's silence meant agreement. It did not. While Vailrun Those was filing his biological limitation notice and feeling quietly satisfied with his work, the Earth Strategic Aerospace Authority was 14 months into a project that had been classified not because it was secret, but because, as Director Osai later explained to a conclave inquiry panel, we didn't think anyone would believe us. The project was called Tartarus Initiative. Its goal was simple, stated plainly in the original proposal document in 12-point font with no dramatic language whatsoever. Establish a permanent human-crewed deep space research and infrastructure station in a high-radiation, high magnetic flux environment to study long-term human physiological adaptation, test next-generation shielding technology, and demonstrate operational capability beyond the inner solar system. The location chosen was the exclusion zone around magnetar PSR J1745290, a neutron star remnant approximately 26,000 light-years from Earth, spinning at extraordinary speed, radiating enough magnetic energy to strip the data from a standard conclave hard drive at a distance of 1,000 kilometers. Every surveyed species in the conclave database listed it as a navigational hazard and gave it a wide, respectful berth. Humanity had looked at it and seen real estate. The original volunteer roster for Tartarus had drawn 14,000 applicants within 72 hours of internal posting. The selection committee had whittled this down to 340 personnel across engineering, medical, science, maintenance, and operations. The selection criteria were, by conclave standards, baffling. The conclave would later obtain a copy and spend considerable time debating what comfortable with weird situations, and doesn't panic when things get loud, meant as formal psychological qualifications. Yolanda Ferris had been the obvious choice for chief engineer. She had previously overseen construction of an underwater thermal vent research station in the Pacific, managed emergency repairs on a crippled orbital platform during a solar flare event, and once, on a bet, spent 17 days in a sensory deprivation chamber to test long-duration isolation protocols. She'd emerged, by all accounts, completely fine and slightly annoyed that no one had thought to pass her a book through the slot. Tartarus Station was being built in stages, 3 rings of pressurized habitat, a central operations spine, and an outer array of experimental magnetic shielding panels that the engineers privately called the umbrella. The umbrella was the key innovation. It didn't block the magnetar's radiation so much as it argued with it, redirecting and dissipating the flux through a series of precisely tuned emitter arrays. It had taken 4 years to develop. It worked about 87% of the time. The other 13%, the crew called interesting days. On an interesting day, the lights flickered, the electromagnetic systems threw error codes, and everyone who worked the outer scaffold had to double-check their suit integrity every 20 minutes. On one particularly interesting day, 3 months into construction, a flux surge had knocked out primary power across the entire station for 48 minutes. The crew had broken out emergency lighting, organized themselves into repair teams in under 4 minutes, fixed the primary coupling, restored backup power, eaten a communal meal in the dark, and then, because someone had thought to pack a portable speaker, held an impromptu concert in the main corridor until the lights came back. Yolanda had written in her mission log that evening, Day 94, Flux Event Category 3, No injuries. Santos learned 3 new guitar chords. Recommend increasing recreational supply allocation. It was this log, later obtained by Conclave Intelligence, that reportedly caused Senior Analyst Preva of the Cathari Science Directorate to request a 4-day personal leave. When asked why, she reportedly said she needed time to reconsider some foundational assumptions. When Herc's scout vessel report came in, filed as a sensor malfunction, but flagged by an algorithm that noticed the anomaly, the Conclave Science Directorate pulled the full telemetry. The images were undeniable. A space station, impressively large under active construction, inside an exclusion zone that the Conclave's own safety protocols rated as Category Omega, unsurvivable for biological entities. 340 humans, working, waving, apparently having a fine time. The Conclave convened an emergency subcommittee. The subcommittee debated for 6 hours. They considered 4 explanations: sensor error, human deception, a previously undetected biological mutation in the human species, or the explanation that kept floating to the top no matter how many times they pushed it down, that humanity had simply read the biological limitation notice, set it aside, and done whatever they wanted anyway. The subcommittee voted to send a mediator. They chose Ambassador S. Suvrak, a senior Cathari diplomat known for her composure, her analytical mind, and her ability to remain calm in genuinely unprecedented situations. She would later describe accepting the assignment as the most consequential mistake and the most important decision of my career, simultaneously. Her shuttle broke from FTL travel at the edge of the Magnetar exclusion zone, and the pilot immediately began expressing concerns. S. Suvrak looked at the station hanging in the radiation-soaked dark ahead of them, already larger than it had appeared in the telemetry images. "Take us in," she said. S. Suvrak had conducted 47 first-contact situations in her 30-year diplomatic career. She had met species that communicated through color changes in their skin. She had negotiated with a hive mind that experienced time nonlinearly. She had once spent 6 hours in a decompression chamber with a species that breathed methane, conducting trade discussions through a translation unit that kept substituting the word purple for sovereignty. She thought she was prepared for anything. The docking bay of Tartarus Station smelled like machine oil, coffee, and something S. Suvrak's olfactory translator described as fermented grain product, recreational use. The walls were covered in handwritten notes, printed photographs, engineering diagrams, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn bracket tournament for something called Best Breakfast Protein Deep Space Edition. A small plant in a magnetic-locked pot sat beside the airlock. It was, improbably, flowering. The welcoming party was 3 people. None of them were in formal attire. One was wiping grease from her hands onto a cloth tucked in her belt. This was Yolanda Ferris. She was shorter than S. Suvrak had expected, with close-cropped gray-streaked hair, eyes that moved constantly, cataloging, assessing, already 3 steps ahead, and the relaxed posture of someone who had stopped being impressed by difficult environments some years ago. "Ambassador," Yolanda said, extending a clean hand. "Welcome to Tartarus. Watch your head on the Corridor B junction. We're still running the ceiling conduit, and it sits about 10 centimeters lower than spec. Coffee." As Suvrak's translator processed this, "Yes, thank you." The coffee was dark, bitter, and served in a mug that read, "I survived interesting day 7, in bold letters above a small cartoon of a flickering space station. They sat in what Yolanda called the good conference room, which was distinguished from the other conference room by having 4 functioning chairs instead of 3, and a viewport that looked directly out toward the Magnetar. A roiling, impossible column of light and magnetic fury that filled the window like a painting of the end of the world. As Suvrak found it extremely difficult to look at. Yolanda had her back to it, reviewing a data tablet. "You're here about the construction," Yolanda said. "It wasn't a question." The Conclave has serious concerns, S-Suvrek said carefully, about human safety in this environment. Our readings indicate radiation levels at your outer scaffold that are 0.74 sieverts per hour on a calm day, up to about 2.1 during flux events, Yolanda said without looking up. Our suits handle up to 4. We rotate the outer crew every 90 minutes, mandatory medical check every shift. Running a longitudinal adaptation study on the side, early data suggests some interesting immune response changes, nothing alarming. Dr. Kapoor thinks we might be seeing early-stage epigenetic adjustment. She's very excited about it. She set down the tablet. Want to see the shielding specs? The umbrella's more efficient than we projected, actually. As Suvrek stared at her. Chief Engineer Ferris, she said slowly. The Conclave's biological limitation noticed specifically. We read it, Yolanda said pleasantly. We have questions about the methodology, actually. Your radiation survivability models, are they based on Cathari baseline physiology or a generalized biological average? Because we think there's an assumption error in Section 4 that significantly underestimates human cellular repair rates under oxidative stress. I'd love to send you our data. Might be useful for future assessments. As Suvrek was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the magnetar pulsed silently, magnificently, lethally. You are aware, as Suvrek said very carefully, that this environment should, by every model we have, be killing you. Yolanda considered this with the expression of someone who had been told something mildly interesting. We were told Antarctica would kill us, she said, and deep ocean trenches, and low-orbit EVA without umbilicals, and 14-month submarine deployments, and a dozen other things that turned out to mostly be a question of engineering and stubbornness. She paused. Mostly engineering. She stood, gestured for S-Suvrek to follow, and led her through the corridors of Tartarus. They passed a workout room where 2 engineers were running on magnetic lock treadmills and arguing cheerfully about something. They passed a small medical bay where Dr. Kapoor was humming to herself over a microscope slide. They passed the bar, an actual bar, with stools bolted to the floor and bottles secured in vibration-dampened racks, called, as S-Suvrek had heard in the scout report, the pressure cooker. A hand-painted sign above it read, "What happens at 26,000 light-years stays at 26,000 light-years." At the end of the tour, they stood at the viewport of Yolanda's office. The magnetar glowed in the distance. The station hummed around them, alive, working, stubbornly, magnificently functional. What do you want us to tell the Conclave? S-Suvrek asked quietly. Yolanda thought about it. Tell them we appreciate the concern, she said. Tell them we're fine. Tell them, she glanced at the magnetar, tell them we'll let them know when we build the 4th ring. S-Suvrek returned to her shuttle, sat down, and spent 20 minutes writing and deleting the opening line of her report. She finally settled on, I do not believe they understood they were supposed to die, and I am no longer certain that this is a flaw. It was the most honest thing she had ever submitted to the Conclave. Space, the Conclave had long established, was not a place for heroism. It was a place for protocol. Protocol existed because space was unforgiving. Protocol existed because improvisation got crews killed. In 4,000 years of Conclave spacefaring history, the survival of sentient life in the void had depended not on individual brilliance or desperate last-minute action, but on rigid adherence to procedure. You trained. You followed the checklist. When things went wrong, and things always went wrong, you followed the emergency checklist. And if the emergency checklists didn't cover the situation, you sealed the bulkhead, transmitted a distress beacon, and you waited. The Conclave merchant vessel Kethai's Dawn, a mid-range cargo freighter operated by a mixed crew of Cathari and Dran traders, followed protocol perfectly when its number 3 hull section catastrophically failed on day 214 of a standard transit run through the outer edge of human-surveyed space. Captain Voruk triggered the distress beacon within 4 seconds of the breach alarm. He ordered non-essential crew to emergency pods within 8 seconds. He sealed 6 bulkheads in under 2 minutes and had his entire crew suited and accounted for in 4. Then he calculated the Conclave rescue timeline. Nearest Conclave patrol vessel, 11 days. The HFY Dawn had life support reserves for emergency pod occupation of 14 days. It was survivable. Uncomfortable, cramped, cold. The pods weren't designed for extended habitation, but survivable. He transmitted the distress beacon and settled in to wait. The response came in 4 hours and 22 minutes. It was not a Conclave vessel. The ESAS Relentless dropped out of transit at 0.3 light seconds from the HFY Dawn's position and immediately began broadcasting on 17 frequencies. The message, translated into 14 Conclave languages with impressive speed, went roughly: ESAS Relentless to distressed vessel, we have your beacon. We're coming alongside, don't shoot. We're going to fix this. Captain Vorik stared at his display. Fix this was not a phrase in any Conclave rescue protocol he had ever been trained on. Through the cracked viewport of his emergency pod, he watched the Relentless approach, a human vessel, angular and efficient-looking, clearly military in design, but with the particular pragmatic ugliness of something built to work rather than to impress. It matched velocity with HFY Dawn in under 12 minutes, a docking maneuver that Vorik's navigation officer whispered was not possible at that approach speed. Then the humans went outside. 3 of them, pressure suits, mag boots, carrying equipment rigs that Vorik's crew couldn't immediately identify. They moved along the outside of the HFY Dawn's hull in the way that Vorik would later struggle to explain this to the Conclave inquiry, felt disturbingly casual. Not fearless, not reckless, casual. The way a maintenance worker moves through a familiar building. The way someone moves when they are not intimidated by where they are. The breach in hull section 3 was 8 meters across, the result of a microfracture cascade in the composite plating, a catastrophic failure that, by Conclave engineering standards, required a specialized repair dock and a minimum of 72 hours of work. The humans had it sealed in 53 minutes. They used tools that Vorik's engineering officer described in his official report as jury-rigged, improvised, and almost certainly not approved by any regulatory body, but demonstrably effective. They welded in vacuum. They cut and shaped plating by hand under full radiation exposure. At one point, one of the EVA crew, a woman whose suit camera feed was later obtained by the Conclave and studied extensively, crawled inside the breach to align a structural brace from within, a position that, if the brace had shifted, would have been unsurvivable. She was humming. The suit audio picked it up. She was humming to herself inside a catastrophic hull breach in open space. When the repair was complete and the hull integrity confirmed, the humans cycled back through the airlock, and the Relentless extended a docking tube. The HFY Dawn crew was brought aboard. They were given warm clothing. They were given food, real food, not emergency rations. A young human medic named Corporal Diaz moved through the rescued crew with calm efficiency, checking vitals, treating a drawn crew member's minor injury from the initial breach event, and explaining everything in slow, careful translated words. Then someone brought soup. It was a human recipe, thick, slightly spiced, served in sealed containers that were warm to hold. Captain Vorik accepted his without fully understanding why and sat in the Relentless's mess bay and stared at it. Commander Helena Marsh sat across from him. She had the manner of someone who had done this before, not the rescue specifically, but the part where the rescued people needed a moment before they could speak. 11 days, Vorik said finally. Pardon. Conclave rescue, 11 days, he looked at her. You came in 4 hours. Marsh shrugged. We were in the area, and 4 hours wasn't great. The beacon relay had some lag. We were hopping for 3. Vorik opened his mouth, closed it. "We were in your emergency pods," he said. "Protocol is to seal and wait." "Yeah," Marsh nodded. "We do things a little differently." She paused, considering. "I think our protocol is something like, if you can fix it, fix it. If you can't fix it, figure out how. If you figured out how but you don't have the right tools, improvise. The waiting comes after all of that." Voruk's crew filed their trauma reports when they returned to conclave space. As Voruk had predicted to his first officer, not one report mentioned the hull breach. Every single one mentioned the humans. The conclave reviewed the incident. The official summary classified it as non-standard rescue operation, effective. Beneath that, in the working notes that weren't meant for public record, a conclave analyst had written 7 words that would be quoted later in history texts across a dozen worlds. They went outside. They just went outside. There were members of the galactic conclave who had watched humanity's activities with curiosity. There were members who had watched with admiration, however reluctant. There were members like S. Suvrek, who had watched with something approaching quiet awe. And then there was the Murath Dominion. The Murath were old, older than most conclave members, with long institutional memory and the particular arrogance of species that had been powerful for so long they had confused longevity with wisdom. They were physically imposing, tall, dense-boned, with redundant cardiovascular systems that made them naturally resistant to pressure and acceleration, and they had built their interstellar reputation on the understanding that strength, in the end, was the only language the universe actually spoke. They had watched humanity with neither curiosity nor admiration. They had watched with contempt, and then with irritation, and then, as Tartarus expanded, as the relentless incident spread through diplomatic channels, as humans began quietly appearing in more and more places they weren't supposed to be able to survive, with something that the Murath would never have called fear, but functioned identically. The Murath Dominion's High Strategic Council met in closed session and reached a unanimous conclusion. Humanity was a disruption. A Grade 4 species with no right to deep space was accumulating deep space capability at an accelerating rate. Left unchecked, they would eventually become a problem. It was better to address problems early, before they became expensive. The operation was called surgical withdrawal. The name implied precision. The plan was simple. A small but powerful strike fleet would hit Tartarus Station with enough force to destroy it, classify the incident as an accident caused by the station's own dangerous location, and deliver a quiet message to Earth that certain ambitions had consequences. No formal war, no declaration, just a lesson delivered firmly in a place far enough from Earth that the optics could be managed. The Murath strike fleet, 7 vessels, top of the line by conclave military standards, arrived at the Magnetar exclusion zone on a morning when the Magnetar was having what Tartarus crew would have called, with resigned familiarity, an interesting day. The Murath fleet commander, Tactical Admiral Groon, looked at his sensor readings and felt immediately confident. The station's power readings were fluctuating. The electromagnetic noise from the Magnetar was severe enough to partially degrade targeting systems on both sides, but the Murath fleet had redundant guidance, and the station did not appear to have anything that looked like military hardware. He gave the order to fire. The first salvo hit the station's outer ring and caused serious damage sections venting atmosphere. 2 habitat modules cracked. Groom began composing the incident report that would describe a tragic accident. Then Tartarus fired back. It didn't fire weapons exactly. It didn't have weapons exactly. What it had was the umbrella, the magnetic shielding array that Chief Engineer Yolanda Ferris and her team had spent 4 years developing and 18 months living with, adjusting, improving, and on particularly interesting days, essentially arguing into submission. The umbrella had been designed to redirect the Magnetar's flux output. Over months of field operation, the engineering team had developed increasingly precise control over that redirection. During the attack's first 60 seconds, Yolanda and her team did something that had not been in any design document. They tuned the umbrella's emitters not to deflect the magnetar's output away from the station, but to focus and direct a portion of it outward, toward the attacking fleet. It was not a weapons system. It was an engineering solution to an engineering problem. The effect on the Murath vessels was immediate and severe. Targeting systems across the fleet went down simultaneously. 3 vessels suffered navigational array failures. One ship's primary power coupling, not designed for that magnitude of electromagnetic interference, exploded. Groon's own command vessel found itself spinning slowly in the magnetic flux, every sensor screaming noise. The attack lasted 11 minutes. When the Murath fleet managed to achieve escape velocity and retreated to a safe distance, they had sustained damage across all 7 vessels. One ship was dead in space and had to be towed, and their formation was in complete disarray. Tartarus had sustained the damage from that first salvo, real damage, structural and serious, but it was standing. Inside the station, in the operations center that had gone from emergency lighting to jury-rigged battle station in under 3 minutes, Yolanda set down her engineering tablet and looked at her team. They were exhausted, adrenaline-wrecked, several of them bleeding from small injuries caused by the impact shockwaves. "Damage report," she said. Lieutenant Torres read from his screen. "Outer ring sections 2 and 4 are compromised. Port habitat module B has a breach sealed by auto bulkhead. Primary power is at 62%. Life support is stable. Medical is reporting." He paused. 2 broken arms, 1 concussion, and he looked up briefly. The coffee machine in the Sea-Wing mess bay took a direct hit from a falling conduit. "It's gone." Yolanda was quiet for a moment. "Prioritize the habitat breach and the power relay," she said. "I'll write the damage report." She picked up her tablet. "Send my condolences about the coffee machine." The damage report she sent to Earth was 4 pages of engineering detail, clean and precise. The attached summary, written at the bottom in Yolanda's characteristic blunt prose, read: Tartarus Station was attacked by 7 unidentified vessels, later identified via hull markings as Murath Dominion military class. We sustained structural damage, have begun repairs, and expect to be at full operational capacity within 9 days. The attack was repelled using modified umbrella array magnetic redirection. Full technical report attached. No fatalities. Recommend conclave notification and formal inquiry. Also recommend budget allocation for replacement coffee equipment. Current situation is affecting morale. On the retreating Murath flagship, Admiral Groon sat in his damaged command chair and stared at the sensor ghost of Tartarus, still broadcasting, still powered, still standing in the radiation-soaked dark next to its magnetar. He had no framework for this. The conclave received both reports, Tartarus's damage summary and the Murath fleet's incident log, within hours of each other. An emergency session was called. Ambassadors were summoned. The chamber, one of the largest deliberative spaces in known space, was filled to capacity. Suvrak sat in the human liaison section, reading Yolanda's report on her data slate, and despite everything, despite the broken arms and the vented modules and the genuine danger, she found herself pressing her lips together to suppress something that, on a human face, would have looked like a smile. They repelled a military strike with their weather shield, she thought, and the thing they're most upset about is the coffee machine. The conclave had expected outrage. Every species in its history, after surviving an unprovoked military strike, had responded with outrage, demands, ultimatums, the formal language of injury and retribution, delivered through diplomatic channels with appropriate gravity. Humanity sent an invoice. It arrived at the conclave secretariat 12 hours after the Tartarus incident report, routed formally through Director Ussa's office with full diplomatic certification. It was a document of extraordinary precision, 17 pages of itemized repair costs for the structural damage to Tartarus Station, calculated in conclave standard currency equivalents, with supporting engineering assessments, materials pricing, and labor estimates. Every cracked panel, every vented seal, every compromised coupling costed out to the last decimal. There was also a separate, shorter document attached. This one was the medical bill. It listed 2 broken arms and 1 concussion, with treatment costs, rehabilitation estimates, and a projected loss of productivity calculation based on the injured crew members' roles and the station's current operational needs. At the very bottom, in a line that would be quoted in conclave diplomatic records for generations, was an additional item. 1. Commercial-grade vacuum-sealed thermal beverage unit destroyed by falling conduit during hostile action. Replacement value, 340 standard credits. Emotional value, incalculable. The Murith Dominion's ambassador, when presented with the invoice in open conclave session, reportedly looked at it for 45 seconds without speaking. What humanity had not done was equally significant. No declaration of war, no mobilization announcement, no speech about justice or sovereignty or the honor of the dead. There were no dead, which itself seemed to unsettle the Murith more than anything else. You could construct a response to rage. You could build a diplomatic counter to grief. There was no established conclave protocol for responding to an enemy who sent you a bill, repaired their station, and went back to work. Behind the scenes, quietly and without announcement, humanity was doing what humanity always did after something nearly killed them. It was improving. The modified umbrella array specs were being distributed to every ESAS engineering team within a week. Not as a weapons system. The documentation was meticulous about this, classifying it as emergency electromagnetic redirection technology, defensive application, but as a capability. A dozen ships were already in retrofit. A second Tartarus-type installation was in early planning stages, this time near a pulsar in the outer arm. 3 universities had published open academic papers on the magnetarflux redirection principles within a month of the incident. Suvrik watched all of this from her liaison office and felt a slow, building sense of something she could only describe as vertigo. Not because humanity was preparing for war, she didn't believe they were, but because she was beginning to understand something about how humans worked that the conclave's entire analytical framework had never accounted for. Every near-death experience made them better, not metaphorically, functionally, measurably, operationally better. She requested a private meeting with Director Ussa and flew to Earth for the first time. Ussa met her at the ESAS headquarters in Nairobi, a sprawling, sunlit complex that looked nothing like what Suvrik had expected. She had expected the headquarters of a species that had just repelled a military attack to look tense, alert, martial. It looked busy. People moved through corridors with tablets and coffee cups and the slightly distracted energy of people who had 17 things on their minds and were working through them in order of priority. There was noise, conversation. Somewhere down a hallway, someone was laughing loudly. Ussa's office had a window overlooking the city. She poured them both coffee without asking and sat across from Suvrik, with the same composed stillness she'd had at that first orbital meeting, years ago. "The conclave wants to know what you want," Suvrik said. "We want our invoice paid," Ussa said. "Amara." Ussa smiled. "We want an acknowledgement that the attack happened, attribution to the Murith Dominion, and a formal conclave record that it was unprovoked. We want the Murith to understand that there is a cost to this." She paused. "We don't want war. Some in the conclave think you're building toward one. Some in the conclave have been wrong about us before." Ussa set down her cup. "We want deep space access. We want the biological limitation notice removed. We want to be treated as a peer, not a ward." She looked at Suvrik directly. "We're going to be in deep space regardless. The only question is whether we do it with the conclave or around it. Usuvrik thought about Tartarus, about the plant in the flowering pot by the airlock, about Yolanda back to the viewport, the magnetar blazing behind her, talking about stress calculations. "Can I ask you something?" Usuvrik said. "Of course." "Are you afraid, any of you?" Usa considered this for a long moment. Outside the window, the city moved and hummed in the afternoon sun. "Of course we are," she said quietly. "We're afraid all the time. That doesn't stop us from going." She paused. "I think you thought that if something was frightening, we wouldn't do it. That fear was a constraint." She shook her head. "For us, fear is just information. It tells you what to be careful about." Usuvrik sat with that. Then she picked up her coffee cup, and she thought about what she was going to tell the Grand Council. And she thought, they are not going to be ready for this. The Murath Dominion made its second mistake 12 weeks after Tartarus. The first mistake had been the attack itself, a failure of intelligence, of imagination, of understanding. The second mistake was more fundamental. It was the mistake of a species that had been powerful for so long that it had only one response to resistance: escalation. They could not accept what had happened at Tartarus. Not truly. A grade 4 species, fragile, short-lived, newly spacefaring, had repelled a military strike using a weather modification array. The Murath Strategic Council had reviewed the incident report 40 times and each time arrived at the same conclusion. It was a fluke, a chaotic environmental variable. It would not happen again. So they escalated. The Murath Dominion deployed a blockade fleet, not to attack this time but to strangle. 37 warships positioned across the primary transit corridors that human shipping used for the outer system. No shots fired. Every human cargo vessel that attempted passage was turned back, boarded, impounded, or disabled. Supply chains to Tartarus were disrupted. A second human construction project, an early-stage relay station near the heliopause, was seized and its skeleton crew detained. The message was clear: you cannot be killed. Fine, you can be contained. Earth's response took 72 hours. The Earth Strategic Armada had not been built according to Conclave warship doctrine. The Conclave's military philosophy, developed over millennia of slow, formalized conflict between species with similar physiological limitations, was based on sustainability, long-duration engagements, mutual attrition, ships designed to survive, to endure, to outlast, conflict as a prolonged negotiation conducted through force. Human military history was not like that. Human military history was 2,000 years of desperate, creative, brutal problem-solving conducted by a species that had fought itself, constantly, across every terrain imaginable, under every condition possible. They had fought in jungles and deserts and frozen tundras and ocean trenches. They had developed military doctrine under conditions of complete resource scarcity, under aerial bombardment, under biological attack, under the specific pressure of knowing that if their side lost, everything ended. They had been cornered so many times, by nature and by each other, that being cornered had stopped feeling special. The ESAS fleet that mobilized was not the largest fleet ever assembled in the region of space near Earth. But it was, by a margin that would later make Conclave military historians genuinely uncomfortable, the strangest. 44 vessels, each one custom configured. The flagship, ESAS Prometheus, was a command carrier designed around the principle that the commanding officer should be able to fight in any conceivable environment, including ones that had collapsed into configurations no doctrine covered. Her captain, Admiral Yusuf Udemy, had previously commanded Earth's Antarctic Strategic Research Flotilla, operated deep-ocean submersibles in the Mariana Trench pressure environment, and written his doctoral thesis on adaptive doctrine in conditions of total environmental uncertainty. He had, famously, also spent 3 years as Yolanda Farasa's operational supervisor during the early Tartarus planning phase. He knew exactly what humans could endure. He had spent 3 years watching them endure it, take notes, and ask for more funding. The ESAS fleet entered the contested transit corridor on a Tuesday. The Murith blockade commander, Fleet Marshal Drun, cousin of Admiral Grun, which told its own story about how the Dominion assigned commands, had 37 ships and complete numerical superiority. He gave the standard withdrawal demand. Udamy's response, transmitted back on all frequencies, was 4 words: "We remember the invoice." What followed was 11 days that conclave military historians would later refer to, in their private correspondence, as the restructuring of certain assumptions. The human fleet did not fight the way the Murith expected. It did not form battle lines. It did not engage in the methodical broadside exchanges that conclave warfare had formalized over centuries. It moved in ways that seemed, initially, almost random, dispersed, shifting, individual ships making independent decisions in ways that should have led to chaos and friendly fire incidents and the collapse of coordinated action. Instead, it led to something that the Murith commanders kept trying to classify as a tactic and kept failing to, because it wasn't exactly a tactic. It was closer to what happened when a species that had spent its entire history in uncomfortable, resource-scarce, dangerous environments finally applied all of that accumulated improvisation to a single, focused problem. Ships that took damage did not fall back. They adapted. The Relentless, the same vessel from the Cutha's Dawn rescue, had her primary propulsion array hit in the second day of engagement. Her engineering team, working in a damaged engine room with partial life support, rerouted thrust through the secondary maneuvering jets and 3 jury-rigged modifications that were not technically in any ship's manual. She became slower. She became more maneuverable. She kept fighting. Crews that experienced pressure and G-forces beyond conclave crew safety thresholds kept their stations. They had, after all, been selecting and training for high-stress, high physical demand environments for years. The medical teams moved through the ships during active engagement, treating injuries and returning crew to stations, because the alternative, pulling injured crew from their stations during combat, was something the human commanders had evaluated and determined was often not the limiting factor they'd assumed it was. The Murith commanders, watching engagement data that didn't match any model in their strategic library, kept waiting for the human formation to collapse under pressure. It didn't collapse. It adapted. Every time a Murith tactic put pressure on a part of the human line, that part changed shape and the pressure dissipated into something new and harder to address. Like hitting water. Like trying to crush smoke. The Murith were fighting a species that had spent its entire existence being told it shouldn't survive its environment and had developed, as a core biological and cultural reflex, the habit of proving that wrong. On day 6, Fleet Marshal Drun requested a tactical retreat to resupply and reassess. The request was done by the Dominion High Council, who were monitoring the engagement from 200 light-years away and could not adequately convey to them what it felt like to be in it. On day 8, 3 Murith warships defected from the blockade line and requested asylum. They had been watching the human crews on captured sensor feeds. One defecting captain reportedly said to his first officer, "I do not believe they are afraid of us at all," and his first officer replied, "I think they were afraid at the beginning. I think they stopped." On day 11, what remained of the Murith blockade fleet withdrew. The transit corridors were open. Udamy sent one transmission to the Dominion High Council. No ultimatum, no demand, just 4 words and a set of coordinates. Our invoice still outstanding. Then he turned the fleet around and went to retrieve the crew of the seized relay station, who had been sitting in Murith detention for 11 days, and who, by all accounts, had organized a competitive chess league and written a collective paper on optimizing life support rationing in confined detention environments. They were fine. They were, in the particular human way, annoyingly fine. The Galactic Conclave had met in full emergency session 217 times in its 4,000-year history. Wars, extinctions, plague events, first contact crises. The sessions had ranged from hours to years, and in every single one the Conclave had known more or less what it was dealing with. The session convened in the aftermath of the Murath blockade crisis was the 218th. Nobody knew what they were dealing with. The chamber held representatives from 4,847 spacefaring species, and for the first time in recorded conclave history, every seat was filled. Species that normally sent diplomatic proxies had sent their heads of government. Species that had been in active cold conflict with each other for decades sat in adjacent sections without incident, too absorbed in the agenda to maintain their usual hostilities. The Conclave's Secretary-General, an ancient Dravathi named Vel Sarath, who had presided over the chamber for 60 years and thought he had seen everything worth seeing, looked at the filled gallery and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he wasn't sure how this was going to end. The first order of business was formal. The Murath Dominion's actions, the Tartarus strike, the blockade, the seizure of the relay station and its crew were reviewed, documented, and formally censured. The Dominion's ambassador, facing the full chamber, offered restitution terms. The terms were reviewed by the human delegation, revised upward substantially, and accepted. The invoice was paid, including at Earth-specific insistence the line item for the coffee machine. The Murath paid it. In the full record of conclave session proceedings, in the formal financial documentation of the 218th emergency session, there exists, to this day, an official entry. 1 commercial-grade vacuum-sealed thermal beverage unit, 340 standard credits, paid in full. The second order of business was the one that had filled the chamber to capacity. The biological limitation notice issued to humanity 3 years prior was formally brought before the full conclave. The argument for revocation was made not by humanity's delegation, but by Ambassador S. Suvrak, who had spent 2 weeks writing her address, and who delivered it standing in the center of the chamber floor, speaking quietly enough that the room had to lean in to hear her. She did not use statistics. She did not cite the Tartarus engineering reports or the Kethai's dawn rescue data or the 11-day engagement record. She told stories. She told them about a plant in a magnetic locked pot, beside an airlock in a radiation zone, flowering. She told them about a bar called the pressure cooker, and a sign about what happens 26,000 light years from home. She told them about a woman with her back to the end of the world, talking about stress calculations with coffee in her hand. She told them about a crew in a detention facility who spent 11 days in captivity writing a paper about how to do it more efficiently. She told them about forewords transmitted over an open channel to a Murath blockade fleet. We remember the invoice. And then she told them the thing she had not been able to stop thinking about since her first visit to Tartarus, the thing that had kept her awake in her cabin on the voyage home, the thing that Osai had said in the sunlit office in Nairobi. Fear is just information. It tells you what to be careful about. The chamber was very quiet. We assessed this species, S. Suvrak said, on the basis of biological limitation. We measured what their bodies could tolerate and we drew a line and we said, this far, no further. We did not ask what they would do about the line. She paused. We have been drawing lines around humans for 3 years. They have walked through every one of them, not by being invulnerable, not by being unafraid, but by being, in a way I do not have a better word for, relentlessly themselves. She looked up at the gallery. I moved to revoke the biological limitation notice. I moved to offer humanity full conclave membership, and I moved to amend the conclave charter with a new clause that I believe this species has earned. The vote for revocation was not unanimous. There were dissenters, older species, deeply conservative, uncomfortable with what humanity represented. But it passed. It passed by a margin that surprised even Suvrak. The formal invitation was transmitted to Earth that evening. On Tartarus Station, in the Sea Wing Mess Bay, where a new coffee machine had been installed 3 days prior, paid for by Murath Dominion restitution funds, a detail that Yolanda had specifically requested, and that gave her quiet satisfaction every single morning. Chief Engineer Ferris read the transmission on her tablet, set it down, and picked up her mug. Her team was around the table. Tors, reviewing power coupling schematics. Dr. Kapoor, annotating her latest epigenetic study data. Santos, playing 3 chords on a travel guitar he'd had since day one. 6 others, eating breakfast, talking quietly, existing in the easy companionable rhythm of people who had been through something real together and come out the other side. So, Tors said without looking up, full membership. Yep, Yolanda said. You think it changes anything? Yolanda thought about the magnetar outside the viewport, still burning, still magnificent, still wholly indifferent to all of them. She thought about the biological limitation notice, folded under Osai's arm 3 years ago. She thought about the umbrella designed to keep them alive, repurposed to keep them standing. Not really, she said. She drank her coffee. Outside, the magnetar pulsed, ancient and colossal and oblivious, and the station hummed steadily around it, alive and working and stubbornly, impossibly, magnificently there. The new clause added to the conclave charter, Clause 4901, submitted by Ambassador Suvrak, passed by majority vote, inscribed in the formal record on that extraordinary day, read as follows. No species shall be assessed on survivability by any metric that does not account for the variable of will. On Earth, in a sunlit office in Nairobi, Director Amara Osai read it, folded her hands on her desk, and looked out the window at the city for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the ESAS Planning Division. The 4th Tartarus ring, she said. What's the timeline looking like? And humanity got back to work.